A lot of people think communication is what comes out of you, right? And I think a bigger part of communication is our ability to actively listen. And I don't think we spend enough time teaching people. It is a skill that I don't know that a lot of folks have, right? The ability to listen. My wife and I struggle with this all the time. She'll say, "You're not hearing me." I could repeat everything she said, but I'm not connecting with her on an emotional level, and I'm not empathizing or hearing her, actively listening to what she's saying. So I think it's that second part of communication that I think we often miss. And there's a myth in that it's just about me getting my message out in whatever form or fashion that I do that.
Hello and welcome everyone to this special roundtable episode of Care to Lead. I'm your host, Cynthia Corsetti, and I'm thrilled to have you join us today. When it comes to leadership, we all know that communication can be either a powerful ally or an ongoing challenge. Our goal today is to bring together a diverse group of leaders and experts who bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to the table. As we discuss the nuances of corporate communication, you're going to get so many amazing insights. Before we dive into our conversation, I'd like to take a moment to briefly introduce our remarkable panel of guests. Today, we are joined by Timo Anderson, trainer at ZingTrain, Zingerman's Training Incorporated, Jeremy Butler of Grand Dynamics, Chris Weber, founder of Foxleigh Commercial Performance, and I'm impressed with this one, the LinkedIn top voice, Rida Fozi, president of TASC Group, and Shireen Hilal, CEO of Maior Strategic Consulting. And all of their full bios will be in the show notes, along with links to websites and socials. So, without further ado, let's kick things off. I want everyone to take a moment to let our audience know what drives your passion for effective communication in leadership.
For me, it's always been a huge opportunity in organizations. I've always been inspired by great communicators. And the interesting thing about my passion for communication comes from actually being quite a shy kid. And so when I was a child, I wasn't the guy who was bouncing around the playground making friends. I was the one who was sitting in the corner watching and observing and being quite quiet. I didn't have a huge amount of self-confidence. But what impressed me were people that did. And I'm still impressed by people who can walk into a networking event, shake hands with everybody, make connections, kind of own the room, because I still find that a huge challenge for me. And so I find communication as being like the big opportunity for me, because I feel like overwhelmed and impressed by people who are just amazing at connecting and communicating. I see some nods from people as well.
Yeah. Who else wants to jump in?
I'll jump in next if that's all right, to kind of piggyback on what Chris had just shared. It's, for me, I learn differently, and I've had a lot of experience with poor communication and the way people have tried to communicate with me. And so I've really kind of infused as my life's mission to be a change agent and communicate differently and help others communicate differently, so that people with different learning styles, different methods of needing to have information shared in kind of creative or innovative ways can hear those messages. So whether that's through storytelling, whether that's through experiential events, really just flipping communication on its head and thinking differently about it.
I think one of the things that I like the most, and the opportunity being at Zingerman's and kind of the concept, having been around for 42 years, we do that kind of success. And think about how we've gotten there is communicating recipes or communicating repeatable things and getting really good at saying, here's the tools to help everybody get to that level, whether it's communicating change, communicating what your picture of success is through a vision, but giving our staff and giving everyone involved. And then as trainers going out in the country and sharing around the world, these same tools that are repeatable and usable in order to figure out how to effectively document and put together some things so that people have it, hear it, see it. And so that to me is the documentation, the recipe that we've created isn't something that is only one-time use or one-person model. It can be something that anyone can adapt and make work.
For me, I've just found it's table stakes in any organization if you actually want to continue iterating, adapting, in a way that's effective and resonant, because the effectiveness of any solution is dependent on adoption and execution. And you just can't understand your stakeholders unless you're asking the right questions and making sure that you have real buy-in for a solution that works in your actual culture and ecosystem. And so even in the strictest command and control organizations, forcing change or using what I affectionately call the cram down method, good luck, right? Because now you're stuck policing instead of continuing to iterate and progress further. And so just having that open communication and understanding what is going to be impactful in our organization and how do we continue to get that feedback and continue making the processes better, it's integral.
I'll jump in. I think for me, I studied English literature. That's sort of my background before I ended up in PR. And I've always been just so wowed and impressed by good writing, good communication, just the way that an entire room can be commanded with a couple of words, the way that, you can enter into like a dream world through a couple of words. Like I find it so fascinating and interesting. And I think that's what really drew me into PR when I got into this field. And the work that we do at TASC is really about communicating what our clients are doing, nonprofit clients who are having impact in the world. And so it's really powerful to see how words and communication can carry an organization forward, whether it's our own internally and how we are communicating with one another, or it's that external, impact, whether it's achieving a fundraising goal or reaching your stakeholders or any other goals that you might have through communication and words.
So we all get that it's great and it's important, but the reality is that every day in business, it's not happening the way it should be happening. And we can all sit here and talk about the ideal world and what's great about it, but can anyone share an experience of a time when it just wasn't working or there was a problem with it?
Well, I think we've all got those experiences, and I guess that's partly where all the passion comes from. And I was just listening to the introductions there, and Jeremy's point around people who learn differently, and Shireen's passion for the fact that the cram down culture, and those resonate massively with me. I've seen that in a lot of organizations I work with. Of I say something and I keep saying it enough times, people are going to pick up on it. And those two, it's the crossover of those two things, that people don't listen, maybe not because they're not listening, but because you're not communicating it in the right way. And I've seen lots of things stall, lots of organizations stall with good ideas, good programs, good projects, simply because they weren't able to communicate it properly.
I'll share a story that some of you may be able to resonate with, right? I was coaching an executive in a large organization, so there are multiple levels of executives. And one executive vice president sent an email to 3 vice presidents, and each vice president ran their own division. She sent one email that had 3 sentences to it. And it was something like, I don't remember verbatim, but it was something along the lines of the marketing. It seems like they aren't getting our message. We need to change directions on this. And she wasn't really super clear. She knew what she was thinking. It was one of these things she just passed off. Well, those 3 vice presidents each interpreted her message entirely differently and started their teams down 3 entirely different paths before they even got together and checked in. And it was only like 2 days, but 2 days literally of work before she figured out that her message was interpreted differently by all these people. Those things cost money, cost time, cost productivity, and are so frustrating.
That totally resonates with me. I remember an example where I was working in an organization and they were trying to align on a positioning statement for a brand, a new launch brand across a number of markets. And they had, a global franchise involved. They had some senior vice presidents. They had directors, different general managers from different markets, all involved in this process to agree on what the exact statement should be, the positioning statement should be for this brand. And it went on for months because no one could, they couldn't really get agreement on the nuance of those things. And then they sent it to the markets. Once they'd agreed, they sent it to the markets, and each one of those markets translated it into local language. And I thought, that's a great example of communication gone wrong. That was like, we're spending so much time on the actual words in English. When it gets to the local market, they're just going to translate it anyway. And then is it going to be the same interpretation, or is it going to be slightly different because it's already open to that? And I think it's another example of how people fail to think through, what am I trying to do here with the communication? Should I be communicating the exact words people should use, or should I be communicating the kind of key concepts that you need to execute in your local language?
That's a great point. And I think what's interesting is the messenger matters too. And so when you are cascading a message throughout an organization, and especially if it's a large one, how it is interpreted, to both of your points, is going to vary. And so sometimes it's more about making sure you have an overarching theme and thought of what you're trying to get across. And then you almost can let each individual department or manager take that and make sure it resonates with their group, right? And so talking about why this matters to our department, why this is something that will help you in your role. That might be different if you're speaking with the tech team versus the marketing team versus whoever. And so I think just having that ability to sort of tweak it and make sure it actually fits is important, because there's so much messaging that if it's not individualized and personalized, it's easy to just let it hit the cutting room floor.
I think too, on that note, having a sense of what the goal of that messaging should be. So starting from a high point, like that high level, so that even as people are interpreting and individualizing, which is really critical and necessary, you're all working towards some main goal. And I think that vision is often not communicated, even if it's from the executive VP to the VP to then marketing leads or other departments. When the vision isn't properly communicated from one level to the next, there's just a loss. The communication deteriorates as it continues to go down that path.
I was going to share that I think that's one of the things that gets me excited about one of our recipes of change is oftentimes organizations, and you talked about the cram down model and that thought, they do the change. Here it is. I've thought about it. I'm going to make this happen. I'm going to push this in our way. And so we do it. And then the first question you get from your staff is, how are we supposed to do this? What's supposed to happen? Right. And then we say, okay, who's involved? What's it supposed to look like? And then what the heck are we supposed to be doing with this? What does it actually mean? And then Rida, your point of why? Why the heck are we doing this piece? And so we go through these 5 steps. And what I will share is we do the same thing in our bottom line change recipe, except we do them in the opposite order. And so my belief is organizationally, you're going to go through these steps and people get angry when you go through them backwards because they have to backstep and you're fixing along the way. Whereas if you start with the idea of what is a clear and compelling purpose? Why? What does it look like? Why are we doing this? What are some compelling reasons? And then get clear with a vision. What is a picture of success? So we all have a clear idea. And Cynthia, you talked about that executive who was trying to get their managers to do a next great step. And they weren't clear. There wasn't a clear picture of what that outcome needed to be. And then say, who needs to be involved? Who are those individuals and who's going to be the stakeholders that are impacted? And then finally think about, let's share this and get a few people to say, how are we going to take first steps? And all of this happens before we do the change. And we know our indicator that the change is really successful is when people in the organization keep saying, aren't we doing this already? Like, I thought we already started this and I'm already using this. I'm already doing this thing. They already know because we've talked about it for a while. And we get initial complaints of that takes too long. It takes too much effort. We need to be nimble and whatever else. And I say, yes, and you're going to do the steps forward or backwards. We're choosing to do them forwards.
Absolutely. And where I was going to go with that is many of us, if not all of us, as children played the telephone game. And it's always interesting to me that we learn that lesson as children, but yet as adults, we continue to play that game. So in your example, Cynthia, for an executive to send that email to 3 VPs to then push that down and to think that the telephone game wasn't going to happen seems to be the first mistake, right? And to me, it ultimately boils down to 3 things: culture, trust, and transparency. And so if you build a culture, as everybody here is talking about, where everybody's on board with a common mission, vision, values, knows where we're headed as an organization, and you have trust within that organization, I think that it can only happen with transparency. And so, the leaders I think who do that the best are the ones that lead with full transparency, and everybody knows kind of where they stand and where they're going, and they're aligned with the mission and ready to go, so that when those messages get passed down, there is more of a common understanding of how to interpret those messages and push that message forward.
Yeah, little kids play it all the time. When in elementary school, it's like you whisper a secret to the first person and it keeps going down the line. And by the time it gets to the end, it's a completely different story, which actually brings me to what I was going to say about like what we're talking about. That executive, like there's different kinds of communication in organizations. And at that moment, that was just a brief thought. She was just like sharing a thought really quickly. And we're all guilty of that. And it's different if I'm going to think, I'm going to send this communication out to my organization. I want to make sure that I know the outcome that I want. And I'm going to think this through. And sometimes our biggest mistakes are happening when we're just thinking out loud, brainstorming. We're on Slack, we're on Teams, we're on, whatever we're using. And I think sometimes that's our biggest mishaps in communications, is thinking out loud or not thinking.
Well, without that context, right? And so part of the problem, I think, is you have all of these antiquated ways that we assume everyone in an institution or an environment is going to get information, right? And so it's word of mouth and meetings, which is kind of like, okay, great, I'm going to fly a jet using a compass, probably not effective. And then you have all these more modern sort of the moment ways, which are IM, but without that larger context. And so that's where I've learned sort of a robust knowledge management process and system where there's always a single source of truth and at least some places that everyone can go that show you sort of the cornerstone strategies and concepts, so that then when somebody throws out that snippet, okay, but it's within a context that now makes sense. Doesn't mean you're going to get it perfect, but at least you get, I think, directionally more accurate.
One of the things I think that we get overlooked a lot is the volume. I'll say volume of the message, because a VP sends out, an executive VP sends out an email to 3 VPs. That's loud, right? The organization hears that because it filters through. Somebody senior has said this. The same is true if you think about the kind of the public sphere of organizations where they put something on Twitter or they put something. Organization, you might have people who are publishing stuff online all the time, LinkedIn comments, but an executive publishes something, it gets picked up by the press, it gets picked up by other people. And I think that's one of the problems is people don't understand the volume that they have. And so they kind of, they put out a question to their team and forget that they're so senior in the organization that stops people doing their job to answer that question, even though it was just a thought. And I've seen that happen a lot. I saw a GM years ago sitting in a meeting with marketing teams, asked a throwaway question about a data point and said, "Oh, it's an interesting data point. I wonder what's behind that." It was 3 weeks worth of work that we all got thrown at us. We came back with an explanation as to what was behind that data point, and the guy didn't even remember asking the question.
I love a good no action required. Just like a little close the loop in your communication, so this person is thinking out loud, they're sending that email and they're like, no action required, just a thought. It takes like 1 second to just close that loop for yourself in sending out a communication. And I think that's also important to think about when you, especially like you said, Chris, if you have that volume, like I'm just thinking out loud here, just brainstorming, just putting this out there. No action required. We don't really need to do anything with this. Maybe we can revisit this at X time, etc. Just a little thoughtfulness, I think, goes a long way too.
I will share it. I don't want to stick too far, but most of our organization, we've got about 750 people now in this business, and we train this across large organizations as well. One of my favorite parts is even if our founder says, "Hey, I've got this great idea," right? And that would, Chris, trickle down because there's a lot of volume. Somebody's going to say to him immediately, to Ari, and say, "What are your compelling reasons and vision?" right? Ideas here culturally, and it's been enculturated that this is the expectation when you ideate and when you put something out. The very first thing is, okay, I need this information that back up support and strength. As a leader, it's an awesome tool because those ideators who throw things up towards you for you to put on your plate and manage, you get to say, wow, that sounds interesting. Can you give me compelling reasons and vision? And it filters some of those kind of extra things that they just want to throw on your plate and not process. And so it becomes a two-way street of holding some accountability for these ideas and kind of does that, this is just an idea. Wait a minute. Are there compelling reasons? Is there a vision before we move anything forward? Inside of an organization that starts to enculturate these pieces allows everyone to have that voice. And whether you're a brand new busser or you're the founder of the organization, we try to use that across.
What are some pointers that you all have for using story in communication?
I think it's critical. I usually say when I go into organizations to help them with change programs that show them, don't tell them, right? And so having real examples of this is how this would work in practice, or even letting folks, for example, if it's a business development initiative, it might be doing some mock conversations. It could be just showcasing examples. Even if you are doing a change management program, cascading real success stories just keeps the momentum going and makes people realize, oh, we're still doing this and there's a reason to continue doing it, and continues that excitement.
Do you know what I think is fascinating? And I want to go connect with Rida here, is that stories are everywhere and we are all inspired, stage, screen, books, by amazing stories. And I think no one could ever argue that we communicate, we learn through storytelling. And I totally agree with you, Rida, that kind of element of, that's one of my passions, is being able to communicate in the way that great authors and great literature people communicate. But if I go and talk to people and advise them, you need to start telling stories across your organization, people don't want to do it. Their slide decks are full of bullet points and numbers, and it's so boring and dull. And yet everyone agrees the great TED Talks, the great movies, trying to get people to actually live this and go to a meeting in front of executives and tell a story. They're like, no, I need to just have data. And I don't know where the problem is. Is it executives who say, don't tell me the story, I want to hear bullet points? I can't imagine that's the case. Or is it our own internal barriers that stop us from telling stories? I'm constantly trying to get people to pull out the examples and tell the stories that will inspire and be memorable for your meetings.
I think in some ways it's we've lost our ability collectively as a society to tell stories, right? So you talked about the kind of the universal nature. I started with that I learn different, but we all learn universally through storytelling. But I think there's an art form to it that many people have lost. And so I think those leaders that are getting data and maybe don't want the story, because too many people have told poor stories where they're telling too much information and the story goes on. And we've kind of lost that ability, or many of us have lost that ability. And we see that in one of the organizations I help lead, where we encourage staff on a monthly basis to share a success story of a client. And they're sitting there reading points off a list as they're talking to their peers versus sharing emotionally from the heart. And there's so much more to that art form that I think we don't coach, we don't teach, and we don't prepare people to be able to deliver those things in an engaging way that's universal and brings language down to a common understanding that's relatable for all the participants in that room.
Chris, if it helps, one thing I've found works a little bit is calling it a case study instead of a story. That way they tie the data to the so what, now what. And so it feels maybe a little more corporatized for them.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good point. Go ahead, Timo.
I was going to share, we had a speaker come in. He's a writer from Ireland who's in North Carolina now. And he talks about the story we tell about ourselves and our place in the world is the single most important element in determining our happiness and the kind of life we will lead. So if you think about that individually, it works really effectively. But I think organizationally, telling that story about what the organization is the single most important element in determining the happiness and the kind of life, organizational life you're going to have. And getting really clear on that picture, we think of it a vision, right? Trying to describe this picture of where we are going to be at a certain point in the future. That's a story that we tell in order to move everyone forward. But to me, the storytelling that you brought up, Chris, is really kind of that element that this is why we exist. This is what we're doing. The data does a number of things, but it doesn't tell a story to many people besides the financial team.
I think one of the interesting things about a story, the structure of a story, which somebody touched upon a minute ago, was that, what's the art form of telling a story? And one of it has to have an obstacle, a challenge, a problem that you resolve. And I think that's one of the barriers that people don't like to share. They don't like to say what went wrong that I overcame, or what isn't going great that we've had to fix. They want to be able to,
or didn't fix. It's still going wrong. It could, yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's part of the challenge of telling a story, is kind of saying, what's the problem? Because am I highlighting problems? I want a story with a happy ending, but without having the journey. But it needs that emotional dip, that kind of problem. And I think there's resistance there. And when you think about the case studies element, a lot of case studies are, oh, didn't we do an amazing job? But it's like, what did we learn from it? And I think the best stories we tell are ones where it's a complete disaster. It's like, everybody knows we learn from failure more than we learn from success. And the stories that we should be sharing are the ones that went wrong. And yet corporately, we want good news. And I think maybe that's part of the barrier. I don't know if people have a view on that.
Well, one of the things that we do with organizations, we teach leaders all the time for every single meeting, whether it's one-on-one or group meetings, to always start with connection before content. And just those little connection moments with each meeting, I think, develop some of the habits of people connecting on a more human level, which might aid to that storytelling when it gets to be when they need to tell that story. There's just one little exercise that can just start making those barriers go down.
Well, Chris, to get on your point of talking about failure versus success, I think a lot of organizations have enculturated that if I talk about failure, that I'm going to be demoted, or I'm going to have demerit points, or I have a negative component. I'm not supposed to come with questions. I'm supposed to, like you talked about, you spent 2 weeks, right, as a team working on this thing, and the person had totally forgotten about it, right? It's about coming in with the answers, not saying, oh, I failed, or I don't know. And so I think one of the things that I found really inspiring here, one of many things, is that asking for help is a sign of strength, right? We teach and share and live. Our co-founders, our managing partners, all the individuals here know that actually asking for help is a sign of strength. And so I think enculturating that and having that ability to tell a story of I failed means you have to have enculturated that failure is an okay thing, and it's actually a great tool to get better. But so many organizations that I know of don't want to do the failure. They just want the success stories. And so trying to mix those two in a culture where if I bring that I failed, I'm going to be looked at differently or negatively is something that becomes very hard to do on your own if you don't have the kind of organizational strength or structure behind it to support you.
I think too, that's where one, transparency, Jeremy, you had talked about, comes in, right? Like, being like, all of us have failed. It's not that nobody in this world has never failed. It's just that we're afraid to talk about it. And so, being vulnerable, transparent, open, and embracing that, and then showing how you learn from it, I think is really critical. And I think too, culturally, that's a very much a tone that can be set from the top down. So, president, chairman, CEOs, executive directors, whomever they may be within an organization, need to be able to set that tone, because if they're embracing that vulnerability and that failure, it creates a better sense of, if I embrace that vulnerability and that failure, then I'm not going to be seen as somebody that just doesn't know how to do this thing properly.
Rida, I appreciate all of that. And I think that's a big part of what we try to do with our organization at Grand Dynamics, is create those opportunities for experiences and for folks across the company to have a simulation or a challenge that they face, so that we can draw out those themes and get them talking about it in a neutral way, where it's not talking about their company specifically, but instead the experience that they just shared together. Where were those breakdown in communications? What could have been done differently? It's okay to fail. If you're going to fail fast and move forward. Agree with what everybody's saying.
I'm curious what people's thoughts are on how AI is affecting corporate communications, good, bad, or indifferent.
All of the above.
I do think that with AI, it's really about like the use case. Like I think the concept of AI is so daunting, but in reality, it's like there are so many ways that we're already using it that's not horrifying and scary and, diminishing of the work that we may want to be doing. I have a running thread with one of my coworkers where we we just send each other the Google generated response to an email. It's been going on for months, and it's just fun and silly, and we do it because it helps us blow off some steam. But it's really funny to see how like predictive text and things like that are just, they actually make me type faster sometimes, and that's great, and that's really great to use. And then there's other there are note taking tools that you can add into your meetings. And speaking of like communications breakdowns, like those note taking tools are fantastic. They can just take notes, send a transcript out to everybody. There may be a couple mistakes here and there, but it generally gathers like the gist of what's happening. So I think it's really about breaking down what tools we're talking about when we talk about AI and thinking about their use and their function and how they can support and supplement and streamline the work that we're doing in order to be able to do it more efficiently, and in order to be able to do it with just taking some of the guesswork and issues that we run into out of the work while taking advantage of these tools that are made available to us.
So I think there's just something amazing about some of this around meetings. I had a fabulous story from a client of mine who had a lady who was struggling with hearing and hearing loss. And she was struggling in meetings because she was having to record and rewatch meetings because she was missing what was being said. And she was finding life really tough and challenging. And the ability to transcribe audio and to then have it as subtitles in meetings was like life-changing for her, to make meetings accessible, to make business accessible for people who are hard of hearing. And I think stuff like that is just incredible when you start to think about the power. And then you think about the power of instant translation, which is now being done. So our ability to communicate, we're no longer reliant on people who speak English often to have to, speak in a second language, and all the communication breakdowns that's associated with, by the way. And I've seen plenty of meetings with, particularly across Europe here, where people have English as a second language. They speak good English, but it's not the same as being a native. And often we use poor summaries or poor metaphors that people just don't understand. Suddenly, these things are incredible opportunities for us to communicate better. So I think, to your point, that's an amazing opportunity when you think about it.
One of the operative words that I heard Rida use multiple times was tool, right? So if AI is used truly as a tool, it's going to enhance things. I think part of the challenge we have with technology is that oftentimes, and I think social media and our phones aren't necessarily tools. They're things that have interests of their own that are calling to us and taking our time and attention. And so I think how we handle that is going to be critical as we move forward in the AI space. And what I hope that it will do is give us more of our time back so that we can move toward more face-to-face communication. Because one of the things we haven't discussed yet, and most of the communication that we're referencing tends to be word-based communication, text, email, AI notes. We're not, and that's only about 7% of all communication. So if you look at the Moravian kind of breakdown of communication, 55% facial expressions and 38% the tone of voice we use, and only 7% are the words that we say. And I find as we're moving further and further down this path of technology, and you throw the pandemic and everything that we experience with transitioning to remote or hybrid workspaces, we're doing less and less where we get context from facial expressions, tone, and we're relying too heavily just on the word. I think AI is going to help us to synthesize that, slow things down, give us more of that time back. But if we don't use that time for true connection, we're going to miss that mark.
I think that's a huge point. And I think with the remote work, it's becoming more and more. And I think kids getting in high school and college now are even less likely to have face-to-face when they get into the workplace because they have grown up with everything being text. And not just text, but abbreviated text without even full words or sentences. So I think that's going to be a challenge. Does anybody agree, disagree that that's going to be a little bit challenging as these young people are entering the workforce?
As someone that employs close to 600 individuals, we see it all the time. There are huge, and not to be generationist, but there are huge differences between the generations. And really, for one of the first times in our history, we have 5 different generations that are all functioning in the workspace together. And I don't know that there's ever been a point of time where that many generations have come together and had to intersect. And then you throw, like we were talking earlier, the remote work. And I think the younger generation, there's a huge appeal to that. And I think another thing we haven't talked specifically about yet is that work-life balance. And I think the younger generation has a better understanding of that. And I'm hoping that Gen Z and Gen Alpha can help teach that to the millennials and the Xennials and the Gen Xers and the boomers a little bit. But at the same time, in terms of having a face-to-face conversation, there's tremendous fear around that. They don't know how to read that context. You have a challenging or difficult conversation. They feel like they're in trouble. They shut down. I got to find a new place to work. And it's like, no, I'm just giving you constructive feedback so that you can process that and improve and move forward. So there's going to be some really unique challenges with the next generation of the workforce.
I think too, the challenge and like opportunity is just redefining some of these structures that we've operated in for years and years and years that have existed far before maybe a lot of us were even in the workforce. Like, I think that there's just like an accelerated pace of change that none of us know how to deal with yet. And, the difference, from the difference between like 40 years ago and 50 years ago, like that 10-year difference versus the 10-year difference between 10 years ago and now is so massive. Like it's leaps and bounds of a difference, with how much change has taken place in that time. So I think that's really the challenge and opportunity, is like redefining what normal is, redefining what opportunities exist here and what those learnings can be, and what ultimately, like, what is the best way forward for everybody now that we have all of these tools, resources, et cetera, that we can use if we choose to use them. How are we going to employ them? What are we going to do with them? What are we going to learn from them? And hopefully come out stronger.
It's a great point. It's interesting because the technology, I think, has evolved faster than we have. And so we still have that same inclination and need, Jeremy, to your point on it's the nonverbal cues, it's tone, it's how you present, it's the smile on your face or not. That is what people really are interpreting. And so when you pull that out, I don't know that there's a technology that has helped us to overcome that gap. I mean, one thing I've always tried to employ is that rule of 3 for communication. And so if you've gone back and forth more than 3 times and you still haven't hit, we all know what we're doing, minimum pick up the phone. At least you get tone, right? And if possible, and if you are all together, get up and walk over and speak to somebody. I do think there's an over-reliance on this is just easier.
Less scary. That's the issue. It's not easier. It's less scary. And I think, Jeremy, you call it out of fear of confrontation, fear of debate. And there's a lot behind that. But I think our ability to nuance that's what I would struggle with. Or not I struggle with, but I struggle with how other generations manage it. I grew up in a world where I could like someone but disagree with their opinion on something. And I think that's definitely something that people struggle with. They're either, and I've got a client at the moment that they're running a campaign on best friends and besties. And it's aimed at younger generations. And the whole concept is about besties. And what's interesting about it is their insight from the younger generation. The research is that they can be besties after a few hours. So you meet someone in a bar and they're your bestie. They call each other besties, and they, connect online, they connect on socials, and they're your bestie. Now, they're not your bestie, but that's how they talk about it. And it's relationships are much more transient. So I have a best friend that I met on holiday for 2 weeks, but then we lost touch. And I have now a new best friend. And so they're kind of in and out of relationships quicker, but also struggle. But the end of a relationship is often, I didn't like their politics, or I didn't like their opinion on a particular sports team or whatever. It could be a whole range of things. And I think that's where it's interesting. And in the workplace, you can't escape that. You have a boss that, they're a great inspiring leader, but they're not detailed enough for you. Suddenly you've got a nuance that you have to learn to adapt to, or is it that we're the ones who are getting it wrong? And that's the other challenge is, is it us that need to change and perhaps it's be more inspired by those guys. But I think that's what's curious about these different ways of communicating.
I'm going to ask a question that I want everyone to jump in on an answer for, because I think this is an important thing that our listeners need to hear. What is the biggest misconception about communication that you believe needs to be debunked?
I would say that a lot of people think communication is what comes out of you, right? And I think a bigger part of communication is our ability to actively listen. And I don't think we spend enough time teaching people. It's again, we keep saying art form, skill. It is a skill that I don't know that a lot of folks have, right? The ability to listen. My wife and I struggle with this all the time. She'll say, "You're not hearing me." I could repeat everything she said, but I'm not connecting with her on an emotional level, and I'm not empathizing or hearing her or actively listening to what she's saying. So I think it's that second part of communication that I think we often miss. And there's a myth in that it's just about me getting my message out in whatever form or fashion that I do that.
I think you're right. And I think that the technology and the texting and the IMs and all of that add to our not practicing our listening skills as well as we might have in the past.
We teach this all the time to our staff to think about active listening, but I was listening to a podcast, and I can't tell you which one it is because there's too many that kind of filter together, but they talked about hearing as a biological skill and listening as an actual practice skill. And that clarified it for me as you were talking about, Jeremy. I can hear everything my wife said, right? I'm doing the biological action, like my brain is processing the information, but I'm not listening. And listening is an action. It's something you have to own and practice and do, just like anything else, typing or whatever else that skill is. And so I think it isn't intuitive because we rely on the hearing part, right? And we rely on the fact that we hear the information, say, okay, I heard it. Great. I have a 13-year-old. He can hear everything that I say. His actions based on doing things from that are very minimal, right? And so it's not that he's not hearing me. He heard all the words, but listening and saying, okay, this is important to Dad or not is one of those pieces. And so I think it's, to agree with you, but to me, that was a really big mental leap as a way to instruct it and talk about it. Yes, I understand your hearing. Biologically, you are built to do that. But listening is what we want you to start to build on and give a differentiation there so that we can discuss it as two very different skills.
So I'm gonna throw a different angle in. So I totally agree with that. I think people believe communication is about broadcast. The angle I'm going to put in, Cynthia, just to put another angle here, is that we try and say too much in our communication.
Very, very true.
I feel that everything we say, we could say in many fewer words, and it would actually help people to understand what it is we're trying to say. Presentations are too long, newsletters are too long, you name it, there's way too much in there, and just people lose interest.
I was actually going to say something similar, Chris, that I think that people think the more you talk, the more effective you will be, the more words you use, the more information you have. And just very often it's like it becomes information overload and nobody's retaining anything anymore.
And then when you add that up, let's think about corporate, go back to the theme of corporate organizations and how they communicate and the communication errors. Every department, every team is told, raise your profile, talk about your success stories, build, whatever your own footprint in the organization. And suddenly what you've got is a lot of noise with a lot of people saying a lot of stuff to everybody else. That to me is a huge communication barrier within organizations. We've got too many people using too many channels to say too much.
I agree with you on that. And a lot of organizations are doing multiple channels. They'll use Teams and Slack and the internal ones. Jira, I think, is one. They're using all of these different tools, and you miss messages entirely. and things fall through the cracks. So there's a lot with AI and technology that's good, and there's a lot with it that can add to our productivity, and there's a lot that can just like wipe us out. We have to be really careful.
Yeah, something I'm asked to come in and do through my firm quite often is assess, for example, why in a particular company there's high turnover, low morale, et cetera, and how do we fix it? And what I find is, interestingly, kind of going back to the point on listening, it's all of these perks that are being thrown at people like, oh, well, we're going to do a cocktail party every fourth Thursday, and we have the ping pong table and this and that. And it's, hold on a second. People want purpose, not perks. I don't know personally anybody who has joined a company or stayed at a company because of the happy hour or the free pizza. And so actually listening and getting feedback from your employees, and I think equally important, it's getting client feedback, right? So that you are iterating in a direction that's actually resonant, is really important. But it's shocking how seldom companies actually listen, especially to your frontline employees. And so I'll also see, for example, a company that will say, oh, well, we're having these issues with our accounts receivable balance. Have you even talked to the people in billing? What are they hearing from clients? What are the pain points that they're hearing on the bills? All of a sudden, oh, well, we'd love to pay a different way. Oh, well, we're having issues on the payment term. Oh, well, your portal is not helpful for us to actually get the transaction done. Great. Maybe you should have actually spoken to people and figured out what the issue is. So to me, that's one major pain point I see quite often.
One of the tricks that we put in place here is we actually try to document those things from our frontline staff. We have a documentation. It's not a complaint form. We call it code reds. We get probably between 25 and 30,000 of these from our staff of 750 per year, right? And what I think there's two key elements that I think have made us successful over this is one, we report these at a weekly huddle. So your team is hearing the ones that are related to you, right? And so you hear that process. So I think there's two things. One, I can almost guarantee that some of those accounting people have shared it with someone, but nothing happened with the data. And so as leaders, if it's a one-way communication, your frontline staff are going to say they don't care, they're not doing anything. And so I think the key element, one of the successes is we get all this information and then we report back and say, okay, here's one thing we're going to try. Here's something we're going to work on. We document that this was happening. So then, if Chris was complaining and Jeremy was complaining and Cynthia was complaining about this one thing and they thought it was a one-off, we can say, hey, this is happening 4 or 5 times in our organization in the past week. That's an issue. And so we start to have some data of those concerns that we're getting from our frontline staff and encouraging them to give more of that information. And it's the repeating back. So I think it goes back to our listening. It's not just hearing that complaint, but it's really listening and saying, okay, this one has moved up to a trend that we need to act on, as opposed to this is one that hasn't risen to that level yet. We'll keep it on the back burner. But it allows staff and frontline staff to feel validated in that process of engaging and sharing and part of the fix. So when something gets fixed, they go, oh, I helped make that happen. Right. And then they value the organization is going to do something as opposed to the complaint file, right, that they do that they know just gets like emptied in the recycling bin every other month because no one's actually doing anything with it.
I love your idea of calling it code red. I'm going to steal that.
We have many articles about it. Would love to chat.
So here's another thing that I think is a misconception about communication, and it's on an individual level, right? It's when I think that I have communicated something very clearly to you, and yet I really haven't. And one example that I have seen, I've been an executive coach for 15 years. So I have seen this frequently where an executive or a leader, not necessarily a senior executive, but a leader will have a conversation with someone, a direct report. And in their mind, they are telling this direct report that if you don't change things, if something doesn't change drastically within the next 30 days, you're going to be out of a job. but they don't want to say that. They don't want to be that direct. They don't want to have that negative conversation. So instead, they'll say something like, wow, we really need to get these numbers up, and, we're going to work together on this, and let's do this. And then a month later, this person's blindsided when they're terminated. And that's a misconception we have on our own. What is the communication that we're trying to achieve? And are we being that clear, even when it's hard?
Yeah, absolutely. I think clear communication can only benefit everyone. Like in a situation in which a person is trying to put somebody on notice, over the next 30 days, and they are fearful and worried, and they don't want to upset this person and all those other things. One, you carry that anxiety for the rest of the 30 days if you were the person who communicated that. Two, there's no clarity on that the other party's part. And then by the time you hit that 30-day mark, the person hasn't met the success metrics that you theoretically have laid out for them. And then they're frustrated because they're like, you didn't ever say this to me clearly. So, and we saw this recently. There was like a viral TikTok a couple of weeks ago where somebody was being let go. They recorded when they were being let go, and they were being given feedback on their performance or having not met their performance goals. And they're like, no one has ever mentioned this to me before. And those moments are horrible for your company. I mean, it just creates such a bad ripple effect. So I think that it's scary to be put in that position to be a leader, to be the person who has to communicate clearly. But ultimately, every time I've chosen to communicate clearly, even when it's difficult, it has turned out so much better than when I've chosen to take a step back because I'm stressed about a situation. It's snowballed in such a bad way. So I think clear communication, truly, we have to start to agree that clear communication is the only way forward. Otherwise, your culture will crumble. Your companies can suffer from it. Obviously, people within the company, people who are working with you, will suffer. It really just creates a really negative environment.
I think it's really scary to think about as a leader that a termination can end up on TikTok going viral. It's like you have to be extremely careful how you handle things these days.
Well, I think what's interesting is I work a lot with clients around commercial relationships, so negotiations and running customer meetings. And these difficult conversations come up a lot. So things like pricing, price changes. And I hear conversations a lot with customers who are like, oh, we need to discuss pricing. And they think they've told them that we're going to increase our prices, and the customer hasn't heard that at all. And so this is a really, really common challenge. And one of the things that is a key foundation for how I think about relationships is we all have two pressures at work. One is results. We need to get stuff done, whether that's a business level or our personal level. And the second pressure we have is relationships. So we want to have strong partnerships, strong relationships with people around us. And we lose balance. And we can, if we're focused too much on relationships and not enough on results, we have the symptom is things like projects don't get delivered and things don't get done. But that's where you find people having these conversations which are too vague. They're not saying what I need, what I require. Their coaching conversations as a leader are poor, so they don't feed back to their team on really what's going well and what's not going well. It's too vague because they're worried about how they are perceived. But equally, I see the opposite. I see people who are very results orientated, and they're all about the numbers, the data, the figures. And they don't focus enough on the human in their communication. And so they're happy to sit across the table with someone and say, it's not good enough, you're not delivering on your numbers. And then they find themselves in a situation where they've got high turnover of staff, their people are unhappy, their people are disappointed, their customers don't like them. And they're like, well, I don't know why, because I'm focused on results. And to me, it's all about that balance. And there are ways to communicate clearly how you feel without, destroying people's ego and causing our fear of having those difficult conversations.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that we often put that failure on the employee. And I would argue to what Rida was talking about, that it wasn't said explicitly, but whenever you issue ultimatums, we know that human behavior doesn't ever meet that. All that does is set the expectation for there is going to be a change that's going to happen. It's very rare that we say, if you cheat again, that person never cheats again, or the 1, 2, 3 magic that we do with children, where by the count of 3, you better do this. Nobody ever gets to 3, right? Because we don't know what happens at 3. So when you issue ultimatums that you've got 30 days to get these up, you can almost assure that the employee is going to fail to meet that metric. But the failure is on the part of the leader, because that conversation shouldn't have been happening 30 days out from when the change needs to be seen. That conversation has to be happening ongoing, and not to be redundant, but that goes back to the 3 things I mentioned before in terms of culture, trust, and transparency. And so to Rida's point, if you have that open communication, it makes those challenging conversations a lot easier to have, because there's trust between us. You know that my motivation is not to terminate you. My motivation is to support you and to get you to be able to perform at a certain level. And I should be listening along the way to understand what are the challenges or the barriers that you're facing to achieve whatever that level is. And then as a leader, my job is to get you the resources and supports within my means to be able to accomplish the task that I'm asking you to do. So I think the failure falls at least partially, if not all, on the leadership in that equation.
I love your points there, Jeremy. And I think about it here. One of the things I didn't even think about for my first year is performance reviews and how scary they are for most people, including the managers who don't want to do the performance reviews. You ask most leaders and they're like, oh my God, that's the worst part of my job. And we try to figure this out and think about it because they're trying to remember a year's worth of stuff, right? And document and come back at. And so, Cynthia, your question was, okay, you have 30 days to fix this. To me, it's a point of, okay, what tools are we giving? As Jeremy mentioned, how are we communicating with them? And we use a lovely tool called Like Best Next Time, right? So I would say, Jeremy, hey, we have this call on sales. I want to hear how it goes. Afterwards, we're going to do Like Best Next Time. And so then after the call, I would tell Jeremy and I'd say, hey, Jeremy, what did you like best about that sales call, about what you did? And then I would share some positive feedback to what I agreed with or something along those lines. And then I'd say, what do you want to do differently next time? And think about that tool of, okay, having you share before I give some sort of constructive feedback, but it's being led as a conversation. And to me, if we're doing these on a weekly basis or a monthly basis throughout the year, that performance review is no longer a surprise, oh my God, gotcha moment. I've had these conversations, so it is actually the label. It's a performance review, right, of all of these regular meetings we've had. So there's no surprises. There's no big boom things or surprising information. If it's going along this pathway, I'm saying, okay, I'm noticing a trend that you are not getting ... done, right? We can do this. And so we put this in as expectations for leadership here. And we teach this tool, whether it be training or leadership, as a way of saying, how am I checking in with either brand new tasks for a brand new frontline employee of, okay, you just did 5 people on the register. What does that look like? What did you like best? And what do you want to do differently tomorrow? We use that as a training tool for leaders. We can say, what did you like best about that call? What did you like best about that meeting you just ran, right? Or that call you made on a one-on-one performance review. And we use this as a way to kind of process and engage. And if we hear that they're totally out of alignment with what we're seeing, we know that that's an opportunity, exactly as you mentioned, Jeremy, before we get to that 30-day conversation, we know that they're out of alignment with the expectations. And we can circle back and say, wow, I don't know that I was clear. Here's what we're looking for. Here's what you're doing. And we get some alignment there earlier on. Doesn't mean we save everybody, but it is a tool that allows us to step in partway down the path and earlier in that pathway.
My neck's going to get sore from all the head nodding in agreement with everything everybody's saying.
So that brings me to a kind of as we try to kind of wrap up this conversation, our listeners are getting a lot of insights. I'm wondering if we could each go through and take a shot at offering our own maybe top 2 to 3 best practices. And it'll be easy for the first person, but I'm just trying not to repeat. So whoever jumps in, 2 to 3 best practices, kind of succinct, and let's have a rapid fire. Who wants to start?
So I'm going to steal one from a TED talk which I saw a few years ago, which I loved, which is about this concept of listening, and we teach the skills of active listening. And the TED talk, the concept was, you don't need to look like you're listening if you are actually listening. And I've been to loads of sales trainings over the years, and they talk about, you need to nod in the right places and you need to kind of make eye contact and stuff. And the answer, and the simple thing is, you don't need to pretend if you're actually paying attention. So my best practice, I think, would be genuinely be present and pay attention to people when you're in a conversation with them. Put your phone away, close your browsers, close your, other things that are happening in the world and have a conversation. And then the second thing would be curiosity. Curiosity to me is so powerful. Be curious about people and then ask a question, because that to me will be a big tip. So there's two there, I think, maybe.
The two I would give you is there's no replacement for face-to-face conversation. So if you're not sure, ask. Let's have that conversation. Let's get the conversation out of words and into a more traditional dialogue. And then the second thing is focus on the strengths of each other and individuals. I think as leaders, we too often have our own way of doing things, and we don't adapt our style to the listening styles or learning styles or communication styles of the people that we're charged to communicate with. So I need to understand every member of my team and how they need to hear different messages. And I have to be able to be the one that's adaptable to be able to relay that information in a way that is understandable and relatable to each of them.
I'll jump in. It's similar to actually what Jeremy said, but I will add to it. So I will not be redundant. But whenever we onboard a new team member on our team, we create what we call a manual on how to best work with me. And you answer about 4 to 5 different questions, and it's everything from like, these are my favorite office snacks to this is the best way to reach me during the workday. This is the best way to communicate with me. And it just lays the groundwork for how people communicate. And it's a fantastic tool for managers on our team. It's a fantastic tool for account leads who are working on different accounts with different folks. And I think what's important about it is that we really index off of it. Like, we really go back to it. If a person feels that they're not being communicated with properly, they will raise it and say, have you read the manual? Have you seen, and it's not very long, it's 1 page. So I think that we're also a small agency and we're a small team. So it gives us a little bit of flexibility to be able to do that, where it's like, we really want to try to build that connection. But I highly recommend it as a way to, however that looks for you, being open about what is the best way to communicate with me. And then I think too, trying to sort of reduce hierarchical thinking in general, because I think that very often a person who is in a more senior position thinks that their approach, their role, how they communicate, how they want to communicate trumps others. And ultimately, as Jeremy said, we all learn differently, we all communicate differently. And it's important to be able to create a culture of respect so that everyone feels heard across the board.
I love that.
To me, I think that I'll share two that I think I referenced a couple of times, is getting people to know the big picture, right? Know how it fits. So why does it make sense? What is those pieces and how is this thing that I'm being asked to do? So getting clear on that big picture when we're trying to communicate. If they don't know where they fit or why we're doing this or kind of where that fits in the larger idea, I think it gets lost. And it's not something that has a kind of the stickiness that we want it to when we're trying to communicate this information. And then the other one I'd go back to is feedback, right? When we're asking for that information, but we're not doing anything with it, we're not responding to that feedback. I learned from one of our managing partners at ZingTrain, Stash Kazmierski, he taught us, if you ask for feedback, you have to respond, right? It doesn't matter what it is. If we're doing 2-day seminars, we respond at the end of day 1 and share it at the beginning of day 2. Right? If we're getting feedback and we're listening to our staff or individuals or customers, whoever it may be, we want to figure out how we're going to share that back, right? Because it shows that we're listening, and it proves the whole concept of paraphrasing, right, is based on being able to put it in your own words and share it back. And so I used to teach this to 2nd and 3rd and 4th graders in doing team, and doing collaborative things and having them work on peer mediation. And one of the first things we wanted people to do who were in conflict is to paraphrase back and forth. And they had to, as 2nd, 3rd, 4th graders leading this, learn how to paraphrase. And so it's the same thing with feedback, being able to listen, process it, and share it back to make sure that it's actually understood.
Well, I know we have some PR experts here, and so I wonder if this will resonate. I think one major issue I see, and it's quite glaring, especially in the larger enterprise organizations I've worked with, is just this complete dissonance between what's really happening at the company and the messaging that's being pumped out more publicly. And I mean, we're in an era where trust in our systems, corporate, political, or otherwise, are just at an all-time low. And so one example is I recently saw a very well-known company that was conducting multiple rounds of large-scale layoffs. And at the same time, their head of culture was pumping out on LinkedIn these honored and humbled posts about how we are, you know, number one in this market for being a people leader, and we're in Working Mother magazine, and we are, you know, getting this industry award for being a great place to work. And I just saw this and thought, you realize we're literally seeing the news reports at the same time. And even for those of us who are not in the company, these things don't match. And so where does trust fit in a mixed message? And who is the intended recipient of these posts? If you're going to treat your workforce like they're a means to an end, don't be surprised when employees are looking at your company as a resume building checkpoint or just what you consider to be quiet quitting. Actions and messaging just need to be better tied. And I'm always surprised when I see, wow, like how are you putting that out, and who's reviewing these posts?
I was going to say what's interesting to me about what you just said, Shireen, is that we as communicators, we have to understand that consumers, stakeholders, our team members, they're very intelligent people, and like I hope we want them to be intelligent. And so when you are seeing those mixed messages, it's so it's kind of silly, because it's like everyone can see through this. So why are we continuing to go down this path and being inauthentic when there's just an opportunity to really own this, or maybe just don't talk
Right.
in that moment, right? Maybe just, that's probably another best practice, know when to stop talking.
I'll add just a couple of best practices as we wrap up. And when you're on a video call, keep your cameras on. When you're asking questions, go one level deeper. So when someone asks you, and it's similar to what Chris said about follow your curiosity, that's what we're saying. It's go deeper. It's ask one more question and really get to the heart to build the connection so that all of our communication can be deeper and more vulnerable and more resilient. And that is kind of where I'm going to wrap up with all of you today. You have provided such great insights and thoughts, and I know that our listeners are going to enjoy hearing all of it. And all of your information will be in the links at the show notes for people to connect with you and reach out to you. And I want to thank the listeners for tuning in today to Care to Lead. If you found this episode valuable and you want to stay updated, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And we look forward to you in our next episode. And remember that leaders who care to lead. So thank you all for being here.